that people have been, sorry, kind of infantilized. And that's what sacred stories, I would say, or the sacred myths of our times, a lot of it, from the Enlightenment to there's a bunch of them, they're like cutesy stories that we tell people to basically simplify their understanding of things. And like, here's the story. Like, this is where you came from. This is where our civilization came from, right? These are meta narratives. But the meta narratives are underpinned by a series of convenient stories. And people get real weird when you start to challenge these sacred stories.
And it's no coincidence, I think, that during the Enlightenment period was when esotericism and secret societies really began to take off. This was, the Masonic Lodge in London in 1717, the Illuminati in Bavaria, many,
Rosicrucianism as well. I mean, all
the
these.
Rosicrucians, yeah, the Count of Saint-Germain, all these mystical secret societies, and all of them have their basis in Gnosticism. And what is Gnosticism but seeking hidden knowledge as a means of control, which at its root is materialism.
Welcome, everybody. We are so back with a new episode of Exiting the Cave. We used to do a fun little show called Escaping the Brave New World back in the day, where we were looking at all the different ways that our reality, our culture, our entertainment, and our thinking is influenced and shaped by a myriad of different factors, many of them unseen, right, or unnoticed in our quotidian life, but which have a major impact on how we view and interact with the world. So we're going to take that a step further now with our Exiting the Cave series. There's already a pretty robust lineup of guests, and the overarching theme here is that our society, like any society, is kind of anchored in a few sacred stories, sacred myths that hold everything together. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? We always need stories as a means of understanding ourselves and thinking. We all have a story. Civilization has a story. It's not, when I use the word myth, we don't mean like a fable necessarily, but a way to understand, major events and developments in a way that we have certain heuristics in how to think about our story, since we don't have all the details. So I thought I'd have Adam on for this first one to explore the subject of the Enlightenment. We've had an ongoing series. The world needs a renaissance, not an enlightenment. World needs a renaissance, not a reset. These things are closely related, and I think that's something that we can explore. Right, Enlightenment happened supposedly, happened hundreds of years ago officially, but yet we've heard a lot about a reset, and transhumanism and a fourth industrial revolution that have a lot of parallels that I think are worth exploring. So before we get Adam to chime in here, I will just open with a quote from Keats's wonderful poem Lamia, which I think will set the tone for our discussion. So this is a very famous passage. Some of you may or may not be familiar with it. Do not all charms fly at the mere touch of cold philosophy? There was an awful rainbow once in heaven. We know her woof, her texture. She is given in the dull catalogue of common things. Philosophy will clip an angel's wings, conquer all mysteries by rule and line, empty the haunted air and gnomon mine, unweave a rainbow, as it erewhile made the tender-personed Lamia melt into a shade. Unweaving the rainbow, cold philosophy. I feel like these are relevant, very pertinent images. And Keats definitely had his, finger on the pulse of that time, which sounds in many ways similar to the kind of thing we're still seeing today, n'est-ce pas, Adam?
Well, Unweaving the Rainbow, that's a direct reference to Isaac Newton and his, I won't call it discovery, but his quantization of the splitting of white light through a prism into its component colors. And that really is a symbol for what the Enlightenment became. I mean, on its own, it was simply a discovery of the workings of nature. What we call the Enlightenment, and I do not like the term given to that era, but it's conventional and everyone knows what I'm talking about. What the Enlightenment did was take the objective discovery, and not just of Newton, but of Galileo and Leibniz and all of the other scientific discoveries of the 17th century, and it turned them into an ideology. And part of what Romanticism was a reaction against that ideology, which is why Keats is the perfect example of this passage. There's some debate of whether we could call Keats a romantic or a classicist, but at his time, certainly, especially when Lamia was written, just after the Napoleonic Wars, the general trend of thought in Europe was a reaction against the Enlightenment. Going back to what that was, it was a view of the world, and by extension, mankind, as mechanistic. All the scientific discoveries and the reduction of observable phenomena into mathematical equations, um, to a Renaissance mind or even to a medieval mind, that would have been a manifest of a rationality underlying creation. What the Enlightenment did to take it, though, did with that was that everything is determined according to mathematical formula, and it's just a question of discovering and manipulating the formula to make the world function according to literally clockwork. In fact, the big analogy of the time was God as a clockmaker. He engineers the gears, sets it up, and then lets it run, and then the world just runs itself. And it's humanity's duty to recognize that, and any human institution or thought or behavior that contradicts this rational preset clockwork needs to be done away with. And that was the view of the Enlightenment, and that is what ultimately produced the French Revolution, which might be considered the ultimate the Enlightenment put into practice. We hear about the renaming of the months of the year, the 10-day week, the reordering of the months, the 10-hour day and the 100-minute hour, the temples of reason. It was on its surface based on rationality, but it was absolute madness that did nothing but destroy a civilization, or come close to destroying it in the process. So that's a lot to unpack
Yeah.
there from a simple line of poetry, but I think that what what is it? Unweaving the Rainbow is really the perfect encapsulation of what the Enlightenment was in relation to scientific discovery and what Keats is criticizing in that line.
Right. And I mean, there is a lot to unpack. And as we were saying before we started to record, there's no way to be exhaustive on this subject, without having, 100 episodes kind of thing. But for one, I'd say that, yeah, what is sort of framed as rationality, or an age of reason, it was really an age of what was being ushered in was radical materialism and reductionism, which are not necessarily the most rational or reasonable approaches to understanding the cosmos, right? I mean, but just
And what it was too, it wasn't an age of liberty either. That's the other, the American Revolution was really the one exception to the rule. What the Enlightenment also ushered in was what we call enlightened despotism, and this is not a period that gets enough attention in the history books because it goes against the narrative. Um, Again, if there's this clockmaker and there's this set of rules, then all we need are enlightened despots to enforce the rules according to what nature has dictated. And so, what you got in Europe in during the Enlightenment was despotism. It was obsessed with centralization, standardization, um, squashing of any dissent but the goal was seen as rational, the ends rather were seen as rational and in accordance with scientific law. So, that was all deemed permissible. The means were deemed permissible in light of that end.
right. And yeah, we can fast forward today where you have the same kind of logic being applied where, again, this materialistic idea of all causality and all reality, that, everything is really just particles crashing into each other, which, what's the reason for it all? It's actually kind of random, apparently, according to, the ultimate enlightenment kind of gurus like Darwin, right? At the end of the day, the idea is still that it's all kind of random, random mutation, and like a higher purpose or reason governing, that's just left to chance and, survival of the fittest, which isn't necessarily the most rational explanation for everything, right? It might be convenient, but there are a lot of mysteries, right? There are a lot of things we don't know about the universe, life, creativity, right? Like, what is the reason? Where do these things actually come from, right? Creativity, or just to say the soul, right? These things don't go away just because we have a body, right? Or we can explain a lot of mechanisms of how the universe or nature works. There's a lot that we can't. And so there's this thing that happens where models are created that conveniently leave out all the paradoxes that are outside the scope of whoever's developing these models. Standard
Well,
models, right? We have
but
them, and they're useful, but only if they're seen as like it's always just a working hypothesis. Our knowledge is always finite, but it's always also unbounded. We're always learning more about how things are working. We're always encountering new paradoxes when we do new experiments, right? When we go further out into space and we test new technologies, or we create new isotopes that have new properties, that we're uncovering new stuff every day. So the idea of this idea of perfect knowledge, or like a fixed set of formulas that can kind of explain everything, there's a paradox there, because, well, when you make a discovery of something that you didn't know, that necessarily means you're going to need new formulas. So how are new formulas created? You still need to make a discovery. There's still a leap into the unknown, and that process of epiphany, right, which Plato, he connects that to the soul, right, and recollection. Discovery, epiphany is like an experience of remembering something that was there all along. You just hadn't seen it. It was, your attention had not been directed to that. And that was the whole point of the dialectical method, was to create a paradox in the mind that would bring your attention to something that you had just not considered, not because it wasn't there. It might have been right in your face the whole time and you never noticed, but you needed some problem or tension that would direct you there. So these are not things that you just can quantify or reduce to a formula, right? There's a certain art and inspiration and imagination that's has to be awakened in people if they're going to pursue these threads. right? And so I think right there, we're already beyond what the Enlightenment kind of admits or allows
Mhm.
into its standard models. And yet these are everyday things in a healthy society.
Well, yeah, and I want to go back to a couple things you said that I would like to expand on a little. When you mentioned Darwin and the survival of the fittest, the triumph of the strong. That's what became fascism. That has its Enlightenment roots. On the flip side, though, there was a determinate view that that's what Marxism is it's a scientific unfolding of human history. There's a preordained formula, and all history is meant to unfold according to it. That's communism. And in fact, if you read the preambles to the Soviet constitutions, they recite the formula. They say, okay, we're at a stage now where we've passed this level of what's supposed to happen, and so now we got to get ready for stage two.
Right.
So we're restructuring our society this way, and it's the very emergence of the Soviet Union itself contradicted Marxist theory, although they came up with explanations for that, which should have clued people in, but history didn't unfold according to that way. And that goes directly to the Enlightenment view that we live in a world that's predetermined by mathematical formulae. Touching again on what you said, though, that is not science. That's actually, you can call it religion, you can call it ideology. I fully agree with you. Science is a continual process. It's a process of discovery. There's a hypothesis, and this is we learned this in elementary school. It was discovered um, by oh, I can't. There was an Italian scientist in the Renaissance, but you come up with a hypothesis. You make a hypothesis based on an observation. You conduct experiments, and they either are consistent with the hypothesis or they disprove the hypothesis. And the hypothesis stands for a while. And if it predicts future events and is consistent, we eventually call it a law. But it's a law based on experience. It's not something that's been written down by a human being. And that's when a famous story when Max Planck, the physicist, was going to study physics. His advisor or his one of his teachers advised him against it, saying everything that needs to be discovered has been discovered already. There's nothing interesting to do. And he was one of the pioneering scientists behind quantum theory, because there were experiments that did not uh, were inconsistent with Newtonian predictions. And guess what? Right now, there's other observations that are inconsistent with some of quantum theory, and there's probably room for revision there too. It's a continual process of discovery and revision, and that's part of what makes the world such an exciting and interesting place to be in, and that's where there's room for imagination and creativity.
I mean, I have always loved the quote by Da Vinci: study the science of art, the art of science, learn how to see, and realize that everything's connected to everything else. That's the full version. But the science of art and the art of science, I think that's about right. I mean, that's people can meditate on that for a while. If science loses its artfulness, I mean, how are new hypotheses going to be dreamed up, if you will, right? Like sometimes an idea will occur to you in a half waking state, right? I mean, I know scientists have talked about that as well, and it's not very different. It's not that different for artists, right? Where you have a concept, but then you have to rigorously unfold it, right? Where like the idea, it exists of its own, right? It has its own existence, and you kind of have to be the servant in a sense and figure out how to unfold it and take away everything that's in the way of the pure expression that when you finally have it you're like, yeah, that's what it was supposed to be. So it's very intuitive
It,
and not intuitive in the sense that you're like it's almost, is that magic, is that mysticism, like does that make me a mystic? That's I was having a conversation with James Dellingpole, and the question of like the supernatural came up, and like what is considered supernatural or not. And it was a bit of a shorter exchange, but like is the soul, is the soul a supernatural thing? We all have a soul, right? We all have this ability to conceive of new ideas, if we want to think about it at the first estimate approximation in the Platonic sense of the soul, right? That where are new ideas really coming from? You can't really locate that in time or space, but yet every human being has this ability, and it's something intimate, right? It happens within yourself, and the spaces of your own head uniquely, right? You can't, it's not like you're sharing a conscious mind with another person. Well, you're going to get people who want to go there after whatever telepathy, Stargate. We'll go visit the Stanford Research Institute one day and ask them about that. But all that to say that there are mysteries, right? There are things that are just realities, the soul, creativity. You can't really confine these things to formulas, and yet we can make, we have experiences of these things every day, perhaps without realizing it. And so I'd say one of the big legacies of the Enlightenment was the the divorce of science and art, which created an even more, the divide became more esoteric between mind and matter, right? It became more occult, right? Because spirit and spirit and body, right? These things, we have a soul, we have a body, um, we have a mind. You can't really locate these things in space or time, and yet they're essential for making objective discoveries, and they're essential for creating art, creating culture, which is how ideas are disseminated and proliferate. So this became reduced to materialism. Sorry, I'm rambling here, but
no,
just
no, no.
the final, then art did this thing where, okay, so there was the Naturwissenschaft, right? So there was the sciences, Natur, and there was Geisteswissenschaft. So this became the great separation of the arts and the sciences, which pretty much goes back to Kant and related schools. So art was now either supposed to be this kind of Apollonian thing, which obviously is not that interesting, right? If it's just all too strict and formal, but there seems to be a lack of that fire, that energy, that inspiration that is what we're always kind of moved by. Or it was Dionysian, right? It was a temporary cathartic moment, an altered state that you can experience. It's a good Hollywood movie, Top Gun or something. You're like, wow. But it's very temporary, right? It's very fleeting. And it's not necessarily related to truth or goodness or any of the other um, higher principles that we think like the greatest art would aspire to, right? It's more just how it made you feel. It's Dionysian, right? Reason and beauty are not necessarily wed, or truth and beauty, in Keats's sense, are not necessarily in the happiest marriage. And I think that has clearly created all sorts of problems in our society, which we could go on listing for many episodes.
Well, yeah, again, you said a lot there. So two things that, and I didn't mean to be about to interrupt, but you said something that made a light bulb go off. But before I get to that, yeah, art during the age of the Enlightenment, as you can expect, was very formulaic. Um, go to music, for example. There was a prescribed key progression in a prescribed form. This is when you had all sorts of innovative forms in the Baroque based on folk dances and things like that. Well, it was in the Enlightenment period that these became uh, chiseled in stone as prescribed forms with prescribed key progressions. And if you go, and I'm just using music as an example, you can certainly see this in all the other arts of the time, architecture especially. But there's a list of each key and the emotional effect it would have in the audience. So if you'd say, okay, I want happy, I'll write in C major. I want dark and depressing, I'll go to D minor, and it was very formulaic. And you can see that not that the music isn't beautiful in its own way, but it was when you get to romanticism in the arts that all that really became unchained, and you have all sorts of innovation in harmony and in structure and in form. And even a use of, in the case of like Beethoven or Schumann, for example, a use of a mastery of the traditional Enlightenment forms in new ways, or that took forms beyond their potential. The other thing I want to say is during the Enlightenment, you mentioned the materialism and the divorce of spirit or soul from body. And it's no coincidence, I think, that during the Enlightenment period was when esotericism and secret societies really began to take off. This was, the Masonic Lodge in London in 1717, the Illuminati in Bavaria, many,
Rosicrucianism as well. I mean, all
the
these.
Rosicrucians, yeah, the Count of Saint-Germain, all these mystical secret societies, and all of them have their basis in Gnosticism. And what is Gnosticism but seeking hidden knowledge as a means of control, which at its root is materialism. Um, there was, there's that old G.K. Chesterton proverb, if you believe in nothing, you'll believe anything. And that's sort of what happened when you had a world that viewed things materialistically. There's that, again, I think this is C.S. Lewis, God-shaped hole that needs to be filled, and they filled it with Gnosticism and spirituality, not as a means of uh, looking beyond reality or into a deeper reality or transcending the physical, um, being at peace or um, in in harmony with the universe or God and his creation. It was a means of control through secret knowledge beyond what was known, which is really just, you might call it ultra science or beyond science. It's because science essentially tries to do that, is to discover the unknown. Well, this Gnostic mysticism was a discovery of the unknown, uh, that with the intention not of disclosing it to the world or adding to human knowledge, but of using it for ends of personal power.
Right. And yeah, I would just add again, like one of the big sort of products of the Enlightenment, um, given this radical divorce between the sciences and the arts, so really feeling and reason, right, the heart and the mind, uh, exactly, that there was a proliferation of occult societies, because really you have this new divide where, okay, the general populace will ascribe to this idea that the world is kind of this mechanistic and materialistic thing, that pretty much everything can be explained through by understanding the mechanism of the thing. It's we're living in a rational machine, right? It's a clock type of thing. And so senses are really the authority for truth, right? It's empiricism, and it's measuring and weighing and phenomena, and then just coming up with the formulas that describe the laws that underpin these things. But it's always just remains at that kind of empirical level. But you're not really allowed to ask why or like, well, why, how do we know that's really what it is and not something else, right? Because that's the thing, we talk about models and science having these standard models, but like before Kepler discovered that planets moved in ellipses, there were other models that describe the observations of Tycho Brahe and Copernicus and whatnot. They invented things, right? They invented epicycles. So on an orbit, you would have an imaginary circle along the path of the orbit, and the planet was not just following the path of the orbit, it was spinning around an imaginary center or spinning in a circle along the path of the orbit. And they were just inventing as many of these things as they needed to account for what they could observe. And you could say in physics today, atomic physics, I mean, there's quite a lot of that going on. There's quite a lot of epicycle style explanations from Higgs boson and the God particle, and like there's always some particle that needs to, or dark matter, there are concepts that need to be introduced, and they'll tell you, if you're talking to somebody that's fairly honest, that like, well, we need this, otherwise we can't explain like all this mass or whatnot and how it's being held together. But like maybe there's a completely
Watch Eric Weinstein's interview. He goes on a very long and detailed rant about this, about how the physics establishment has been wedded to quantum gravity for the last 50 years, and no one has been able to explain anything with it, and yet they're married to it. So that's exactly correct.
Yeah. And so this gets back to this question of sacred stories and sacred myths, where they have the guise of objectivity or science, but they're really not. They're actually, very ideological, and there's a deep religiosity associated with why these ideas are so essential to the standard models, because you probably need a new model. Um, and so even there, we could say that this idea of trying to divorce one's relationship with truth from emotion. I mean, the people who think like that may be a bit naive, in the sense that if you are not truly a lover of wisdom and a lover of truth, the idea that you're not going to lie to yourself, or that you will subscribe to convenient models and explanations, whether because they're backed by authority, whether because of your career, right, and your status. We all saw that with climate gate, which
Oh
Delia
yeah.
Cole, who I recently chatted with, I mean, when the emails for ClimateGate came out, in terms of just how much the scientists were fudging the data and creating hockey sticks to justify, this linear correlation between CO2 and temperature increase. That is crazy. That's just not true, and it's so wild how untrue it is. But it's not that hard to believe when you see like the lengths to which they were lying, fudging data. Even the
Well,
polar.
and don't forget the money behind that too. When
Yeah.
there's money, when there's a financial interest in perpetuating a narrative, people are going to perpetuate the narrative.
So all the more though, this idea that there isn't a subjective aspect that involves loving truth, and what happens when people lose that, and they're coming more from I am smarter than you, and like I'm an authority and you can't challenge me. It's very naive. So yeah, I mean, people who want to divorce the two, yeah, we shouldn't lie to ourselves, right? Unless what's in our heart will have an effect on how we perceive things, and yeah, what we're actually drawn to, and how much of a capacity we have for lying to ourselves, which I think people would be surprised at, how dishonest they can be with themselves. Um, so yeah, I mean, we could go to a lot of places at this point, but yeah, I do think that yeah, now we have the whole AI thing, which is also another thing that I think, as far as sacred myths and stories, I mean, there's a lot of doomsday talk around it, but Adam, you and I, we had just talked about before this article, by the latest article by Ted Joya, about how to ruin your literary reputation in one shot. And it was just about how all these major publications, from Sports Illustrated to Business Insider, who are adopting AI for stories and for editorial purposes and journalism, they're all tanking, right? They're all imploding, and but it's
And he also described a literary contest that didn't check whether it was written by AI until after the prize was awarded and found that it had I think its top three prize winners were all AI written.
yeah. So this idea that AI robots are going to replace human beings, I mean, it's more of a cult, right? Like there's not really much rational justification for it. Yes, robotics and automation in manufacturing and stuff, I think it's good, right? And it just means that your population is migrating into higher and more diversified skills, things that robots can't do, right? So that means necessarily your economy in a healthy society is actually going to be more and more reliant on innovation, creativity, which is not what the robots do. That's what the humans do. And so you're just talking about more the need for more high skilled labor, which is technically if you're going to have an highly automated uh, industrial sector, right? Even building bases on the moon or Mars, technically, you probably want that to be built by robots until human beings can get there, and so that it's all ready. Since we might need some time, then right, if we let our imagination run a little, there's no shortage of things that human beings could or should be doing or could be discovering, or creativity that could be fostered. Our entire education system technically needs an overhaul. I'm going to be speaking more about that with Matthew Crawford in our next episode, who led one of the top math teams in the United States and like the highest level math competitions. And he was going into neighborhoods with young people that didn't really have access to much resources and whatnot, and he was teaching them a method that allowed them to become the highest math performers in the country. So we're going to talk more about how much sabotage is there in our education system as well. So maybe it's not
Well,
that.
and that's the problem with going back to this deification of AI. AI, it's basically what it is it's a glorified calculator. Back in the day, if I wanted to compute, the sine of pi over 8 or something, I'd have to use a slide rule or write it out by pencil. Now I can just plug it in, a calculator and get the value of it. AI does that, but to the nth degree. It's a tool to speed up and assist your work, but where there's this deification is it creates an approach in people where they can farm out their thinking to it and it doesn't work. I did an experiment. I was writing an essay recently on some obscure poets, and I was trying to look for some of their work. So I figured, oh, maybe Chat GPT can pool the resources of the internet and point me in the direction. It led me completely wrong. It gave me works that were not even written by these people, or it made stuff up. And I spent hours on a wild goose chase when I actually tried to verify the work it was doing, and then it's funny. You type in, okay, where can I find an actual text? And then it goes, oh, sorry, I got confused. It literally says that. Oh, sorry, I got confused. Here's what it really is. And I thought that, and I question the utility of anything produced by AI beyond, a mere mathematical calculation or pointing you in the direction of a real source or something like that. Same thing, and I told you this story too. In the legal profession, this became a thing, and I even ran into this myself. Attorneys are farming out their writing to Chat GPT or Grok, and they're generating in common law jurisdictions, you cite to court decisions for your authority, and they're making up court decisions. And lawyers have been caught doing this and being fined for it. And it was another attorney in a case I was involved with. The federal magistrate recommended an $8,000 fine for it. And this it's and attorneys, after the first few news stories broke, attorneys keep doing this
Mm.
because they're treating this as something to farm out their thinking to instead of doing the work themselves. And this is becoming a plague in every profession. So, they're talking about white collar workers will all be replaced, in 2 years. Uh, I don't see that. I don't see AI. Yeah, I mean, maybe they'll be initially, and then, when the system falls apart, they'll realize we need actual human minds to do this work. But I'll get off my soapbox now.
And I'll get back on mine. No. So yeah, I mean, again, I think they're trying to create a new sacred myth, a new sacred story. Uh, James Delling-Pole used the term "our dark overlords." I think it's kind of funny. I like it. So yeah, our dark overlords are our transhumanist sort of guru, World Economic Forum folks, who, at the end of the day, I mean, all of this is kind of, and I'd say even the Enlightenment ideal of rationality, underpinning it is a rather bleak and pessimistic idea of humanity, which is why, where like, you can't have too much faith or think there's too much potential in human beings, such that you need something like Kant's categorical imperative. You need a formula to tell you like what the right thing to do is morally, because you just can't trust human beings to actually have moral instincts, right? And that was one of the great um, disagreements that Kant and Schiller had, which is that Schiller was saying, well, the way you develop moral and complete human beings is, well, that's actually the role of beauty and of art and culture, because it allows one to cultivate the heart and the mind, right? And to bridge the two, because art has a sensual dimension, a material dimension, and form, but it's also has an idea, right? It has a form that's immaterial, that is imparted from an idea into matter, right? Like any sculpture, right? Schiller gives a great example that a sculpture or carving on brass plate, I mean, you may see like a Greek god, right, or an allegory or a story, a depiction of the human form, but it's not actually human, right? It's just stone or it's brass, but it's been imparted through the form. It's been elevated to something more than just this raw material. And the better one can do that, and the more natural, or among other things, and uplifting that these images can be, the greater the talent behind it. Um, but what was I saying? I was saying something right before that. I lost my train of thought.
You were talking about when you went into Schiller, you were talking about his disagreements with Kant.
Yeah,
Um,
right. So just to say, yeah, there is this pessimistic idea of human beings, and I'd say it comes more from not knowing how to properly develop oneself, right? And kind of, what is needed to inspire creativity. And this is the kind of thing that we'll be talking more about that with Matt Crawford, where he was saying that to teach math, for example, to teach advanced math and to get regular students, or students that are just maybe smart, but how do you turn them into the highest performing math whizzes in the country? A lot of it was through stories. So you would present advanced math problems in the form of a story. And so storytelling is actually, it's very important in education and to communicate any kind of idea. And I mean, I think we could see that with the ancient Greeks, right? Why is a lot of the work of the most sublime expressions of beauty, how is it so enduring? Well, a lot of it comes by way of these myths that say something that's hard to say think present ideas in ways that are hard to forget, right? There's something compelling. There's a depth of meaning that is essentially endless, right? You can always kind of further explore it or continue to elaborate it, right? And artists to this day, right? We go back. I have certainly. We go back to old ancient Greek myths, and there's new insights that can be drawn from them and can be further developed within our own modern context. And we're actually going to have some nice ones in the latest issue of New Liar, our magazine, which is just days away, by the way. So just
Wonderful.
to say that I think this cold philosophy, not philosophy, which is the love of wisdom, but this cold philosophy, this reductionism, is essentially a spiritual or mental disease, right? Or an epistemological, um, it's a fallacy in terms of how the human mind, human creativity, how discoveries are made. It purports to know more than it does, and by that it kind of overlooks the most important mysteries, which are the true source of wisdom. Right, when we acquaint ourselves with the fact that we are more than flesh and blood, but that's actually where creativity, imagination, these things come in. So yeah, if we do that, I think our idea of human beings becomes a lot more uh, optimistic, and that itself, just a change in morale. I mean, the effects on people, right? Especially young people, and it's very nonlinear, right? It's not something that you can just chart on a map on a chart or something. But we have to be willing to recognize, the shortcomings of this pure enlightenment reductionism that parades around as reason.
Well, yeah, and I think that example of the story problem in math, that perfectly encapsulates what art is. I mean, math, there's nothing more abstract and a priori than mathematics. I mean, that's the ultimate example of knowledge that is not grounded on experience. And yet, when you have the word problem, the kind you get in middle school, two trains traveling from opposite directions at these, that shows how these concepts apply in our everyday life. And that's really what art does. We can talk about concepts of hubris and pride and love and all these wisdom, all these abstract ideas. But then when we see the human drama played out and how these ideas affect us or how they're personified in characters or in events, that they make sense we take them in. I think it makes a stronger impact than just learning about the abstract concept itself. That's what the ancient Greek drama, epic poetry is, down to the novels of our own day. It's the illustration of abstract concepts made concrete through human interaction. And that's the power of art. And that's why works written thousands, hundreds of years ago are still relevant today. And why, even though themes that you would think have been exhausted, the love, romantic love, erotic love, you'd think, there's nothing more to say about that.
Mm.
And yet we can still produce fresh works today about those same themes because they manifest themselves in an infinite amount of different ways in our own world.
Yeah. And I mean, I think, yeah, this is where there's this question of the eternal that, I mean, whether it's in art or science, I think it's kind of hard to avoid, right? If we're going deeper. And yeah, the same theme. I mean, there is no limit to certain ideas. They always have to be rediscovered, right, with every new generation, anyways. And but the times will always change. So the form that these ideas take, I mean, you can never fully divorce an idea from, the age in which it is born or conceived, right? There's still going to be some trace of the age in which you're in. But as Schiller
And
said,
I would add the culture too, because don't forget there's that other permutation, not just time, but culture, which again adds a whole other level to the variety of manifestations we get of these ideas.
yeah, and this is Plato's paradox of the one and the many, which I mean, I will always kind of go back to this at one point or another. It's all about how you resolve the paradox of the one and the many, right? Because you have something that is eternal or constant or unchanging, right? We can associate that with truth or even just ideas, like you said, whether of love, whether of discovery, whether of suffering. They're always going to come back. They can't be avoided. But there's also something always changing in terms of every individual is unique. Everyone has their own unique soul, right? And I always like that quote from Saint Irenaeus that, yeah, every individual human soul is more unique than a human face. So we all identify each person, their face, their visage. That's, when you think of a person, you think of that particular face. He makes the point that the soul is even more distinct and even more particular, which I think is a very beautiful idea. And
It's totally true though, because I don't know if you get it, but someone comes up and say, "Oh, you look exactly like so and so."
right, right,
But no one would say, "Oh, your personality or your soul is exactly like so and so," because inwardly we're there. There's infinite ways we're unique from each other.
yeah. Unless the cynic here, chime in, I would just say that caveat being that unfortunately, in a Brave New World system, a lot of people are not really invited, right? The invitation to kind of go deeper, if they don't really run into it, right, and they're stuck in a 9 to 5, they have a lot of responsibilities. It's not easy to develop or get acquainted with one's deeper self and or get to know oneself, right? And I
Sure, I guess better put, we all have that potential.
yes, and yeah, and I think that's what's important because sure, yeah, in real life, hey, all sorts of people, whether it's because of external circumstances or whether the person was just kind of lived a nice cushy life and they're just kind of good looking and had a surface level interaction with the world that just always kind of worked out. You have those people, right? um God bless, right? God love them. uh you know uh but yeah, there is always that potential, and unfortunately, I mean, in an unhealthy society, the people who come fully online or who are kind of more online or more in tune with some of the less popular or less obvious realities are people have had to kind of overcome something, right? They may have they've had some of their illusions shattered, whether it's because of a tragedy, right? And oftentimes, unfortunately, or JFK had a bad back. I think that actually he came from this high aristocratic sort of family, like the closest thing to royalty that you have in the United States, but uh, because he had these physical sort of ailments and challenges, it humbles you, right? And
Well, and his
humility,
brother was killed in the war. I mean, his
humility,
sister was lobotomized by her father. I mean, yeah, even what seems the most charmed life has its drama and its tragedy.
right? And so, unfortunately, in our kind of society, it's oftentimes people that have had to be humbled or become humble. They could have become bitter, right? There's still always a choice that's being made there, but they have access to something that is actually that other people who have a more surface, who've had the luxury, you could say, or whatever, of a more surface. I don't want to call it luxury, but more surface interaction with the world, for better for worse. yeah, they're not necessarily going to have to search. They're not going to. They're not necessarily going to be confronted with the fact that there's certain things they don't know or that they need that they currently don't have, that they're going to have to go on a journey. And I think those journeys are good. And oftentimes, even people, when they'll say that I didn't want to go on the journey at first, they were thankful, right? That they had the trials or the initiations that they had to undergo. And I mean, in ancient Greece, you had that, right? There was a sense of initiation of young people. Sports and competitions were actually part of that, as well as religious rituals as well.
Well, and every culture has that. There's always a coming of age ceremony. Even if you get, you can talk about some that are still toned down, the Jewish bar mitzvah, the confirmation, in Christian. The only one that downplays the coming of age is modern secular society. There is no coming of age, and I think that's purely intentional. That's where you get the phenomenon of the overgrown child.
Oh yes, you're reminding me, and I know you have a hard stop at in 9 minutes. So yeah, we will wrap it up. And hey, I think this is good news because yeah, we could go on for a while. The term that comes to mind, and I do want to bring this in, it's neoteny. Actually, we'll end on this fun weird note. Are you familiar with the term neoteny? To be a neotness?
I can figure out what it means from the root.
Right.
But go ahead and
Well, the root.
explain.
Tell people what the root is.
From neos, which means new or young, or neania is a young man in Greek, and
Right.
uh,
So
so
neoteny, Julian Huxley, Aldous Huxley's brother, was actually looking at this in biology. Yeah, it's basically young, like a salamander that reaches sexual maturity while still having traits of infancy or early stages of life. And so there's kind of this acceleration of certain traits while there's like a retardation of other developmental features. And Aldous Huxley actually has a novel where it explores this, Eyeless in Gaza, and which I still want to read, but I know that that
yeah, I'm gonna take a look at that. I haven't read it either.
yeah. So we're gonna
I've heard
be
of the title.
yeah. I am working this into an upcoming feature. I've been playing with the idea for a while. The Woodstock anniversary is coming up again, and so I am preparing for a new.
Perfect occasion for it.
I don't want to make a new classic, not a part three, but a follow up epilogue to The Devil at Woodstock, which is gonna be real fun. And yeah, so just to say to wrap this up, your point that yeah, people have been sorry, kind of infantilized, and that's what sacred stories, I would say, or the sacred myths of our times. A lot of it, from the Enlightenment to there's a bunch of them, they're like cutesy stories that we tell people to basically simplify their understanding of things. And like, here's the story, like this is where you came from, this is where our civilization came from, right? These are meta narratives, but the meta narratives are underpinned by a series of convenient stories, and people get real weird when you start to challenge these sacred stories. But I think they're useful because we don't have, nobody has time to just exhaustively, we don't have time for the rise and fall of Rome, Gibbon's rise and fall of the Roman Empire for every subject.
Decline and fall.
Yeah, decline. We don't have time for tomes, but technically that's not the best way to get at it. It's to look at these sacred stories and understand, or just take a second look. Is it really the full story? And I would just argue, if anything else, it's way more interesting. So, I mean, we can end on that note. We're going to be coming back. We're going to have a lot more of these. So, Adam, thank you for joining me.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, everyone, for watching, and we'll be back again shortly.